Hey everyone, welcome back to Luna's Truth. Today, I've got a story that's equal parts shocking, emotional, and, if you listen closely, surprisingly beautiful. It's about a man who thought he had everything under control until his wife quietly flipped his world upside down. This is my wife's secret plan. So make yourself comfortable and let's begin. Our story begins with a man named Evan. Evan had always believed that being tough, assertive, and in control was what made him strong. He wasn't cruel, but prideful, stubborn, and very protective of what he thought being a man meant. His wife, Julia, was the opposite, calm, clever, and patient. She loved him deeply, but she also saw a gentler side of Evan that he refused to acknowledge. They'd been married for 4 years, and though they were happy, tension quietly brewed between them. Julia wanted to work, to build her own success. Evan didn't like that idea, not because he didn't believe in her, but because he wanted to feel needed. He wanted to be the provider. And that's where the story takes a turn. One evening, after another argument about her career, Evan came home to something unexpected. Candlelight, music, Julia waiting at the table, wearing a smile that melted all his frustration away. That night, they made up passionately. And the next night, and the one after that, Julia's affection became constant, consuming. Evan thought it was love, but it was something deeper, something planned. You see, Julia had a friend named Sylvia, a doctor, and the two of them had been talking. Soon, Evan found himself taking vitamins Sylvia had prescribed. He thought they were to help with exhaustion. But over time, he began to change, not dramatically at first. He felt calmer. His anger faded, his skin softened, his hair grew thicker. Even his shape began to shift ever so slightly. He didn't notice right away, but Julia did. She started buying him new clothes, saying his old ones didn't fit anymore. Slimmer shirts, softer fabrics, and one day, his underwear drawer changed completely. Gone were the cotton briefs, replaced with silky ones. When Evan asked why, Julia laughed lightly. "Oh, honey, they're easier to wash, and they'll feel amazing. Try them." He resisted, but she smiled, leaned in, and whispered, "Please, for me." And that's how it started. Weeks turned into months. Evan became more patient, more thoughtful, even more gentle. The people around him noticed the change, and strangely enough, they liked him more. At home, Julia would compliment him constantly. His soft hair, his smooth skin, his delicate charm. At first, he blushed with embarrassment, but over time, he started to enjoy it. He didn't realize that the walls he built for years were slowly being replaced by silk and sincerity. One day, Evan confronted Julia. He asked about the pills, the constant changes, everything. She didn't deny it. Instead, she said softly, "I just wanted you to stop fighting yourself. You don't have to be someone you're not, Evan. You're beautiful when you let go." He didn't know whether to be angry or grateful, because deep down, part of him did feel free. For the first time in his life, he wasn't pretending to be strong. He just was. In time, Evan accepted his new self, not as a punishment, but as an awakening. he began wearing what he liked: soft fabrics, delicate colors. Not because Julia wanted it, but because he did. The transformation wasn't revenge, it was love, the kind that strips away pride and shows who we truly are. And that, my friends, is how a marriage built on control became a story of understanding, freedom, and self-discovery. Months had passed since Evan's quiet transformation began. The tension that once filled their home had melted away. Julia had started her dream job, and Evan had settled into a new routine, calmer, more peaceful, though sometimes he caught himself wondering who he was becoming. He still worked from home, his soft-spoken voice now a contrast to the man who once barked orders across boardrooms. And though he told himself everything was fine, part of him missed that fiery edge, the feeling of power. But there was one thing he couldn't deny. Julia seemed happier than ever. And strangely, so was he. One afternoon, Julia mentioned a company dinner. She wanted Evan to come along. He hesitated, his hair now brushed past his shoulders, his clothes slimmer than they used to be. "Evan," she said with that familiar calm, "you look amazing. You just don't see it yet." So he agreed. That night, Julia helped him pick out an outfit. Dark trousers, a soft cream blouse, and a thin silver chain around his neck. Nothing outrageous, but for Evan, it felt different. When he looked in the mirror, for a moment, he froze. He didn't look like the man he remembered, but he didn't look bad either. At the dinner, Julia introduced him to everyone as Evan, of course. But when one of her coworkers, a young designer named Lena, shook his hand, she smiled in a way that made him uneasy. Throughout the evening, Lena kept talking to him about art, travel, the feeling of being caught between who people think you are and who you might become. Something about her words stuck. Later, when the night ended, she told him, "Don't be afraid to become your reflection. Sometimes that's where freedom hides." And then she was gone. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He stood in front of the mirror, the same one that had watched him for years. The man staring back wasn't angry. He wasn't proud or defensive. He was softer, yes, but also lighter. He picked up Julia's hairbrush and hesitated, then began to brush his own hair. The motion felt calming, almost symbolic. Each stroke seemed to wipe away another layer of guilt, of pride, of fear. And for the first time, he whispered the truth aloud. "I don't hate this person." He smiled, genuinely. Not the smirk of the old Evan, but a smile of someone who had finally stopped fighting himself. The next morning, Julia found him in the kitchen, humming quietly as he made breakfast. Her eyes softened when she saw him. The blouse still on, hair tied loosely back. "Morning," he said with a small grin. Julia didn't speak at first. She just walked over, took his hand, and whispered, "There you are." And Evan realized she wasn't talking about his appearance. She was talking about him. Evan woke to the sound of rain. It fell gently against the windows, washing the night away. Julia had already left for work, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and a note on the counter that read, "You looked peaceful last night. Don't lose that." He stood there for a long time, holding the note. It was strange. Months ago, Such words might have felt patronizing. Now they only made him curious, peaceful. The word hung in his mind like a new language he was still learning to speak. He poured himself coffee, watching the pale reflection in the glass. The person looking back wasn't just softer, they were different. His hair brushed his shoulders now, his jawline less defined, eyes more open. He had changed. And though he still answered to Evan, the mirror was whispering something else, something unnamed. That afternoon, while checking emails, a message appeared from Lena, the designer he had met at the dinner. "Hi, Evan. I hope you don't mind me writing. I'm curating an art show next week. It's called The Versions We Hide. I thought you might like it. You struck me as someone who understands that better than most." He read it twice, then 3 times. For reasons he couldn't explain, his pulse quickened. The gallery was downtown, quiet, intimate, full of soft lights and whispered conversations. Lena greeted him at the entrance, her smile easy and warm. "You came," she said simply. Her eyes flicked over his outfit. A simple gray sweater, fitted jeans, a scarf Julia had bought him last month. Nothing dramatic, but something about the way he wore it felt different this time. Confident, perhaps even graceful. "I did," he said, smiling nervously. "I'm not sure why." Lena tilted her head. "Maybe you're curious about the version of yourself that you stopped hiding." Evan laughed under his breath. "You make it sound so easy." "Nothing about it is easy," she replied. "But honesty rarely is." They walked together through the exhibit. Paintings, photographs, fragments of self-portraits that blurred gender, emotion, and memory. One photo stopped him, a close-up of a face, half covered in lace, half shadowed. The caption read, "Becoming isn't losing, it's remembering." He stared at it for a long time. His reflection shimmered faintly on the glass, almost blending with the face in the photo. Lena stood beside him, her voice low. "That one's mine," she said. "It's about the moment you realize you don't have to choose which part of yourself deserves to exist." He turned toward her. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. And suddenly, without meaning to, he whispered, "Sometimes I think Julia didn't just change me. Maybe she gave me permission to stop fighting." Lena nodded slowly. "And maybe now it's your turn to decide what you'll do with that permission." They stood in silence, surrounded by soft music and the hum of voices. The air between them was fragile but alive. When he returned home that night, Julia was sitting on the couch reading. She looked up as he entered, her eyes softening. "You went to the show?" He nodded. "Did you like it?" she asked. Evan hesitated. "It made me realize something." She put her book down. "What's that?" He took a breath. "That I don't feel like the same person anymore. And maybe that's not a bad thing." Julia smiled, not surprised, as if she had been waiting for him to say those exact words. "Then maybe it's time to meet whoever you've become." He sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The rain had stopped, and moonlight glowed faintly through the curtains, brushing against the silver chain around his neck. It was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of uncertainty anymore. It was the calm that comes after finding a truth too gentle to name aloud. The morning after the gallery, Evan woke with a strange stillness inside him. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was anticipation. Something had shifted, subtle as a whisper. He went about his morning as usual. Coffee, quiet music, the slow rhythm of an ordinary day. Yet everything felt slightly out of sync, like his life had been tilted by a degree only he could sense. When Julia came into the kitchen, she looked radiant, hair tied up, light makeup, a white blouse soft against her skin. She kissed his cheek and said, "You seem lighter today." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." "Thinking about last night?" He nodded. "Yes, and about me." Julia didn't pry. She just touched his hand and said, "Whatever you discover, Evan, I want you to know I'm not afraid of it." Then she left for work, leaving him with a sentence that hung in the air like sunlight through thin curtains. He spent the rest of the day restless. The mirror in the hallway kept pulling at him every time he passed. He would catch glimpses of himself, the hair, the softness in his eyes, the gentler way his mouth curved when he wasn't thinking about it. By afternoon, he'd found himself standing in front of the mirror, fully, facing it. He whispered, almost shyly, "Who are you?" No answer, just his reflection, patient and kind. He brushed his hair back, studied the way the light caught the side of his face, and then, quietly, instinctively, he said a name, Mara. He didn't know where it came from or why, but when he spoke it, it felt like the first breath of a language he'd forgotten. Mara. The name settled inside him like a heartbeat finally falling into rhythm. That evening, Lena messaged him again. "How did you feel after the show?" He typed, deleted, typed again. "Like I met someone I've been avoiding for years." A moment later, the 3 little dots appeared on the screen. "Then don't avoid them anymore." She invited him out. "Just for coffee," she said. "Nothing heavy, just you and me." He hesitated, glancing toward the mirror again, as if seeking approval. Then he replied, "I'd like that." They met at a quiet cafe near the river. Lena wore a loose beige coat and her usual air of gentle confidence. When she saw him, her eyes lit up, but not with surprise, more like recognition. "You look comfortable," she said softly. Evan laughed. "I wasn't sure what that even meant until recently." They sat by the window, the world passing outside in soft motion. For a while they talked about nothing: art, the city, the smell of rain. But beneath it all was an invisible thread, humming quietly between them. At one point, she leaned forward. "Can I ask something personal?" He nodded. "What would you call yourself if you could start over?" Evan froze. Then, before fear could stop him, he said it. Mara. The name landed in the space between them. Lena's expression softened, almost glowing. "That suits you," she whispered. For a moment, he felt the world shrink into a single heartbeat, hers and his, matching. Later that night, Julia came home to find him in the living room. He was sitting by the window, wearing one of her oversized sweaters, lost in thought. "How was your evening?" she asked, setting down her bag. He looked up. "Different." Julia smiled. "Different is good." There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries the weight of unspoken truth. Then Evan said, "I think I found a name that fits me." Julia didn't move. "Do you want to tell me?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Mara." Julia's eyes softened. "That's beautiful." She walked closer, knelt beside him, and took his hands. "Then let's see who Mara becomes." He looked down at their hands, hers small and certain, his trembling but steadying, and for the first time, the world didn't feel like something to fight against. It felt like something to grow into. I'll call it the next morning. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't just see Evan or Mara. He saw both, layered, complete. And in that quiet moment, he realized that maybe he didn't have to choose at all. It began with small things, a new way of brushing her hair back, a softer shade of shirt, the quiet pleasure of perfume caught on her wrist when she thought no one was watching. They were not disguises, they were experiments. Each small gesture tested a boundary that had once been an invisible wall. Julia noticed, of course. Sometimes she would look up from her laptop and smile, as if she could see the question forming in Mara's mind before she even asked it. "Try it," she would say. "See how it feels." There was no laughter, no surprise anymore. Just space, room to become. One Saturday morning, Mara met Lena at a small boutique hidden between a bakery and an old bookshop. The air smelled of lavender and fabric dye. Inside, there were racks of soft blouses, linen skirts, light jackets. Nothing exaggerated, nothing that felt like costume. Lena trailed a hand across a row of scarves, then turned toward her. "Choose something that feels like you," she said. Mara's fingers hesitated over colors, gray, cream, pale rose, then stopped at a muted blue dress. Simple, but the fabric shimmered faintly when it caught the light. She held it up, uncertain. Lena nodded. "That one." Trying it on was the hardest part. The dressing room mirror seemed merciless at first, reflecting every flicker of doubt. But when she finally looked at herself fully, her breath caught. The dress didn't transform her. It just made visible what had been waiting all along. When she stepped out, Lena smiled without words. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent and vast. But Mara felt a stillness inside her that was entirely new. They walked through the park after that, coffee in hand. The breeze tugged at the hem of the dress, and for a fleeting moment, she forgot to be afraid. That evening, Julia was waiting at home. She looked up from the couch when Mara entered and said softly, "You went out like that?" "Yes," Mara answered. "How did it feel?" She thought for a moment, like I stopped hiding from the air. Julia crossed the room, reached out, and touched the fabric of the dress. "You look beautiful," she said simply. Mara laughed under her breath, but there was a tremor in it, half joy, half disbelief. "You really think so?" "I do," Julia said. "But that's not what matters. Do you?" Mara looked toward the window, where her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. The answer came quietly. Yes. Over the next weeks, she began introducing pieces of that self into daily life. A different way of speaking, a new softness in her movements. At work, people just called it confidence. At home, Julia called it peace. And in her messages, Lena called it truth finding its shape. There were difficult moments, of course. The first time a stranger stared too long. The first time an old friend didn't recognize her voice on the phone. But each time, the fear ebbed a little faster. What frightened her most wasn't rejection. It was how natural everything felt. One evening, the three of them met at Lena's studio. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and rain. On the walls hung new pieces from the next exhibition, blurred portraits of people mid-movement, neither one thing nor another, caught in the act of becoming. Lena poured wine into small glasses. "I'm calling the show In Between." Julia smiled. "That's a good name." They talked for hours about art, about honesty, about how strange and beautiful it was to live inside a changing shape. Before leaving, Lena took a small photograph from her desk and handed it to Mara. It showed a window reflected in a mirror, the light fractured into soft blues and silver. "For when you forget that you're allowed to exist exactly as you are," she said. Mara turned the photo over. On the back was a single word, handwritten, "Becoming." She slipped it into her pocket and whispered, "Thank you." That night, as she lay beside Julia, the photo resting on the nightstand, she realized that there was no going back, and that she didn't want to. The world hadn't ended, it had simply widened. And somewhere in the space between who she had been and who she was becoming, Mara finally felt at home.